All righty. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Kim Lutz. I'm with America's Watershed Initiative. For those of you who aren't familiar with our organization, America's Watershed Initiative, or AWI, is a Mississippi River Basin-wide organization spanning all 31 states, the Appalachians to the Rockies, Northwoods to the Gulf Coast. And we focus on two key strategic themes. One is providing science and data to inform decision-making, and the other is collaboration to facilitate on-the-ground action. And so in that spirit of trying to get science-based information out to broad audiences, we launched this lunchtime webinar series earlier this year. And we're delighted today to have Dr. Rob Jacobson. Rob is a former USGS research scientist and currently an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri School of Natural Resources, where he works in interdisciplinary research in river ecosystems with a focus on large river ecology, in particular the endangered Pallid Sturgeon, invasive carp species, indicators of aquatic ecosystem integrity, and ecosystem services in large river floodplains. So today, Dr. Jacobson is going to be talking about the Pallid Sturgeon and Missouri River recovery. So we're delighted to have you here, Dr. Jacobson, and over to you.
Great, thank you very much, and thank you to Kim and everybody for giving me the chance to talk to you today. I'm sharing my screen now. Is that showing up okay for everybody? Okay, good. Yeah, so I've retired from the USGS a couple of years ago, and I'm an adjunct professor at the University of Missouri. Just a little bit about the kind of work that I used to do. I was the chief of the River Studies branch, where we did this interdisciplinary studies for river science with focal topics of endangered species like the Pallid Sturgeon, least tern, piping plover, whooping cranes, invasive species, a large program with invasive carps, native mussel habitats, floodplain dynamics, data management strategies, and adaptive management, collaborative decision-making. Put that behind me. The team is still going strong in my absence, luckily, and I think they've been doing some really good work on the Missouri River, as well as moving into the upper Missouri and other tributaries of the Mississippi River Basin. I want to start out with just a little bit of right, I'm having trouble changing. There we go. A little bit of geography about the Missouri River Basin. It's very large, about 1/6 of the area of the United States. It's the longest river in North America. It has North America's largest reservoir system on it, with about 91 cubic kilometers of storage. And these are storage reservoirs that provide hydropower and flood control services, and are not built for passage of fish or boats. They generate about 10 billion kilowatt hours of annual hydropower. That's the big service provided by the system. The lower, about 1,200 kilometers, is channelized from Sioux City, Iowa, down to St. Louis, Missouri, and that's the part of the river I'll be talking about mostly today. Also, from the point of view of the Mississippi River Basin, it does provide 68% of the sediment to the Mississippi River, 40% of the water, 28% of the total nitrogen load, 38% of the total phosphorus load, and some Pallid Sturgeon, as I will show. So this reservoir system is highly altered. The hydrograph here near Sioux City, Iowa, just downstream where the dams, and you can see how the hydrograph has been changed. The width of these bands is the interquartile range for each day of the year. And so naturally there were two spring peaks of runoff. The reservoir system has been very successful in cutting those off. And so now the reservoir is operated to maintain flows, especially for navigation, from April 1st to the end of November. And in some years also increasing flows quite a bit over what they were naturally, as they need to evacuate the reservoirs. Reservoirs have also been very successful at trapping sediment. This is some classic work I'm sure many of you are familiar with from Bob Mead, showing the sediment load of the Missouri and Mississippi River Basin in terms of the width here is being proportional to the sediment load, showing that before the dams were put in, Missouri River was the dominant source of sediment, the Mississippi River. Afterwards, it still is the dominant source, although a lot of that sediment load has been decreased. We updated some of these numbers in a paper in 2009, showing that the modern day sediment load is about 17% of it was historically. Historically, the suspended sediment load coming out of the Missouri River was 320 million tons per year. And then my colleague Dave Hyman and his colleagues have updated this in 2011, coming up with essentially the same number for the sediment load at Herman, but also looking at the sediment load at St. Louis, showing that Missouri still contributes almost 60% of the sediment load of the Mississippi River. In its history of alteration and exploitation, one of the first things that happened in the Missouri River was snagging, getting rid of the large woody debris. This is a painting from Carl Bodmer from 1833, showing the many snags in the river, and these snags were responsible for sinking as many as 300 steamboats on the Missouri River. But the big change in the Missouri River were the massive changes in physical habitat as a result of the bank stabilization navigation project, which was essentially completed in 1982, although parts of this began in the late 1800s. And here's a picture of what part of the Missouri River looked like in 1894, showing the wide channel, abundant sandbars, rapidly eroding cut banks. And after channelization, this is what the river looks like. And I just point out that each one of these small brown pieces here is a rock channel training structure that's been constructed in the Missouri River. So the top width of the river now is about a third to one half of what it used to be. So the very strict changes in the river. You can see that now those rock training structures are some of the most dominant habitat features in the river. So along with that physical habitat, there's been a whole lot of institutional change. This is the timeline of institutional change, and I won't go over this, starting with Lewis and Clark exploring the Missouri River and coming up to the present. But there have been many, many events that have resulted in where the Missouri River is today. Decades of floods, droughts, listings, litigation, and legislation, especially floods and droughts. Every time there's a flood or a drought, the upstream states or downstream states change their view about how the river should be managed. For the last 40 years or so, there's been some level of restoration effort, and I have restoration in quotes, realizing that's not really restoring back to a pre-European condition. Adaptive management is applied since 2008, and it was rebooted in 2018 that I'll talk about. And restoration has become increasingly reductionist, focusing on avoidance of jeopardy to listed species, and I'll be focusing on the Pallid Sturgeon. I break this into 4 phases. The first one is historical habitat replacement. Second, with the ESA listed species, looking at historical habitat, but specifically those that are used or thought to be used by the species, and then a single species dominant conservation. And then where we are today, loss of that single species dominant focus and more looking at resilience and flood risk reduction, which don't seem like they're very connected, but I'll hopefully bring that around. So phase 2 was historical replacement of habitat lost to the Bank Stabilization Navigation Project. And there's a mitigation program that was introduced in the Water Resources Development Act in 1986, which essentially tries to, has authorized the replacement of almost 33% of the lost habitat in terms of acres of water, sand, and the meander belt. So the comparison here is this is Lisbon Bottoms, Jameson Island in the Missouri River. And this is these 2 units. There are now 2 units of the Big Muddy National Fish and Wildlife Refuge, where there have been a couple of chutes that are constructed, channel has been widened, and connected floodplain, trying to get back some of the natural diversity of habitat. Things really changed, though, with listing of these 3 species. Pteridolys term, which is now delisted, the piping plover, which is still listed as threatened. I'm not going to talk anymore about those species. It's another part of the story. I'm going to be concentrating instead on this fish on the right, which is the Pallid Sturgeon. The one on the left here is a shovel-nosed sturgeon, closely related species. So the Pallid Sturgeon used to be found throughout the entire Mississippi and Missouri River main stem. It went up as far as northeastern Missouri and all the way up to Three Forks, Montana, and all the way down to the Gulf. And then when the dams were built, of course, it's totally fragmented the system. The fish has been essentially extirpated where the dams are. There's a population of Pallid Sturgeon near the confluence of the Yellowstone River. There's another story up there I'm not going to get into, but there's zero recruitment in this area, but a lot of effort to try to recover the species. In the lower river from Gavitt's Point Dam down to St. Louis, there's a small non-zero recruitment. It's not known at this point whether the recruitment is the level that it can sustain the population. And I'm not going to concentrate much on the lower river because of genetic information that has evolved showing that there's a hybrid swarm of pallids and introgress with shovel-nosed sturgeon, so that the recovery prospects for the pallid sturgeon, although they are found down to the Gulf still, are not considered to be as favorable. The pallid sturgeon is mainly a Missouri River fish. Here's the confluence of the Missouri and the Mississippi, and the pallid sturgeon is adapted to turbid environments, so it follows this turbidity plume into the Missouri River when it does migrate upstream out of the Mississippi. This is the life cycle of the pallid sturgeon. The uses a lot of river. The adults migrate hundreds of kilometers upstream. They lay their eggs over coarse, hard substrate. Then once they're fertilized, they incubate for 4 to 7 days, and then the free embryos drift downstream for 11 to 14 days. The important thing here is that once the fish gets to be about a year old, 2 years old, the annual survival is 65 to 95%. The issue is what's happening in the first essentially 2 weeks of its life, where the survival is very, very low. So there's been a lot of focus on that. In phase 2 of the conservation, the effort was trying to look at the natural habitat template and replace some of that. Part of that was changing the hydrograph, very, very contentious sort of stuff, and it only lasted for about 5 years before the Corps and the Fish and Wildlife Service gave up on that, trying to give some spring rises to create spawning cues for pallid sturgeon and summer low flows to help in the fish's larval stage. Bigger part of this was the 20 to 30 acres per mile of shallow water habitat that was prescribed in the 2003 biological opinion. And this was a Jeopardy biological opinion, so these were requirements to do the 20 to 30 acres per mile. And that shallow water habitat was taken from the historical template, 0 to 5 foot deep, 0 to 2.5 feet per second, developed in side channels, channel margins. Phase 3 started in about 2007. First of all, there was always pushback from socioeconomic stakeholders. They were opposed to agricultural land conversions, and they were concerned about sediment releases that were being created by the Corps as a habitat was being constructed. Plus, a lot of scientists were looking at this from the critique of habitat-based approaches. If you build it, they will come approach was found wanting. So the first time that we had, or the second time actually, that the NRC wrote a report on the Missouri River was dealing with sediment management. And they said that, look, sediment from these shallow water habitat projects is not really an issue, but the Corps should do a better job of biological justification for the kinds of restoration activities it was doing. And this was followed up by a report from the Missouri River Recovery Program's Independent Science Advisory Panel that looked specifically at the spring pulses. And they also said, spring pulses were not really effective the way they're implemented, but the Corps needs better ecological endpoints for its restoration and should do a timeout for an effects analysis. The effects analysis is basically saying, what do we know? What do we need to know? What do we not know about a listed species? I was asked to lead the group to do the effects analysis for the pallid sturgeon. We did a series of reports. Those reports were fundamental to the science and adaptive management plan, which then became the basis for the environmental impact statement and the 2018 biological opinion, which was a non-jeopardy opinion because the agencies had faith that what was practiced in the science adaptive management plan would successfully move things forward. There are a variety of elements in that science adaptive management plan. I'm going to talk mainly about interception rearing complexes because it was one of the dominant hypotheses and also the most contentious one. And this is the idea that in this highly engineered system, for a very young drifting free embryo, 0 to 14 days old, that it was not possible for them to exit the navigation channel and get into supportive habitats, essentially saying there needed to be some sort of off-ramp to get these fish into supporting habitats. This was called interception rearing complexes, and it's important to look at where these might be in the system. We look at spawning potentially has been documented throughout the river, but if we look at these upstream spawning events as an example and look at fairly simple one-dimensional advection dispersion equations to look at drift. Based on average speed, these fish would end up down in the lower Missouri River. But if we looked at the faster elements of those models, they would end up into the middle Mississippi. So the middle Mississippi becomes a part of the question of how to recover Pallid Sturgeon in the Missouri River. So the IRC issue was treated as an adaptive management experiment. It was actually a quite elegant adaptive management experiment, a staircase design before after control impact with sequential elements of both treatment and control sites. In addition to that, there was a fair amount of research that was also defined as part of this. This is an example of one of those IRC sites at Searcy's Bend, where there were just some very subtle changes that are made to wing dikes through here, but it was able to create these pathways. This is actually a study that we did where we had rhodamine dye in the Missouri River showing the success of this interception rearing complex in intercepting those particles. And on the right was a calibrated two-dimensional particle tracking model. So we show that 25 to 50% of these particles will be intercepted. That doesn't show that it would affect the population, but it does show that they're effective in at least intercepting these particles and putting them into a more supportive environment. Nevertheless, the ARC experiment was suspended because of congressional concerns about the effects on navigation and flood risk. Congress required ERDIC to write a report on that, which they did in 22, and they documented that the effects on navigation and flood risk were immeasurably small. But the Corps said it was not able, with the lack of support, it was not able to continue doing the experiments with interception rearing complexes. And so in 2024, they said they needed to go back to the table for consultation with the Fish and Wildlife Service and the Endangered Species Act. So where that kind of gets us right now is that plausibly the Endangered Species Act is played out, and Pallid Sturgeon really can't be relied on to be the main mover of Missouri River as it has been in the past. There's been a lot of restoration fatigue. There's a question too about where the ESA is going. There's a new redefinition of harm, which would exclude habitat, which had major effect on how the Missouri River is viewed. And there's also been more frequent invocation of the Endangered Species Committee of the God Squad that is needed to evaluate situations where it is not possible, is deemed to be not possible to recover a species. And this quote is from Martha Williams, the former director of the Fish and Wildlife Service. All bets are off with this administration. So we don't know where the Endangered Species Act is going. There are other laws that have been important for Missouri River conservation. Among those, I think the Bank Stabilization Navigation Project Mitigation Authorization, which is continuing. And that gets us to this fourth phase. Not that it's not driven so much by Pallid Sturgeon anymore, but it is driven by flood risk reduction. Missouri River has been affected by these large floods, substantial amounts of money. Of course, the 93 flood, which was also very big on the Mississippi River. But this is the latest of that, the 2019 flood, that really got people thinking about maybe there's better ways to manage the system. At the same time, we're looking at the climatic record now, which shows the effects of climate change. So these are annual runoff data. This is upstream from Gavin's Point. So that's the unregulated flow going into the reservoir system. The gray line is the median. The black line is just a moving average. But what this shows is that these wet years, 1997, 2011, and 2019, have been growing wetter in recent times. The bottom is what's happening upstream from Hermann, Missouri, where there's more influence of Gulf moisture, showing the same thing, maybe starting as early as the 1950s. The implication is that a lot of folks along the river now starting to get the idea that flooding is getting worse, and is likely to continue getting worse. The thing that people are doing to address this is looking at giving the river more room to move. So levee setbacks following the pattern that's been used in Europe. So here's an example. This is particularly well documented example at River Mile L536. There was about 1,000 acres put into this new batcher zone. The red is the new levee setback. It is, however, very expensive, 103 million for about 5 miles of levee reconstruction. And it might be difficult to justify that using the Corps' benefit cost analysis methods. But Anytime we look at a levee setback, it requires more land that can be put into the bank stabilization, navigation, mitigation project. So to sum things up a little bit more, this shows the history of these 4 different phases. The graph on the bottom is acres put into the mitigation project, and the top graph is the dollars being spent on the Missouri River Recovery Program. So we see after award in 1986, with a lag, a lot of acreage was put into the Missouri River, but declined rapidly. And after 2017, there was very little until 2025. At the same time, we look at for the money in the Missouri River Recovery Program, the 2003 biological opinion spurred a lot of investment. And about 70% of this, among the 3 species, 70% of this was for Pallid sturgeon. That started to decline with some of the fatigue that I talked about, and with the idea that the effects analysis in the 2018 biological opinion would get things going again, but the budget numbers became high, fluctuated quite a bit, were substantially lower than they were in previous years. Overall, it's about $1 billion been spent on the Missouri River Recovery Program. And then finally, this little bump here is a little bit more land that has been put into the BSNP mitigation project most recently. So trajectory from past to present, 40 years of progression from holistic to reductionist restoration efforts, increased and focused on the exact ecological needs of the Pallid sturgeon. And that increased ecological precision has failed to define sufficient common ground between the species and the socioeconomic objectives. Those IRCs are actually very small things when it comes to the kinds of things that have been done on other river systems. And it was thought that focusing just on exactly what the Pallid sturgeon needs, that there would be less conflict with navigation and flood risk reduction. I want to stress the recovery program has some notable conservation successes. Done a lot of population augmentation in the system. There's a bypass project in the upper river that's been highly successful. They fund a lot of good science, independent science review, adaptive management planning is outstanding, and the bird management has actually been quite successful. But the lack of stakeholder agreement on management objectives has created this persistent impasse, especially with implementing ESA for Pallid sturgeon on the lower river. So now we're in that 4th phase. It looks like the common ground may exist between flood risk reduction and conservation objectives, which are good for floodplains, but not necessarily for the sturgeon. So thank you very much for your time. Looks like I might have gone over somewhat, but I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much. If folks have questions, if they can please go to the bottom of your screen to the Q&A box and add them there. Although I do see one of the attendees has their hand raised, so we're gonna try to unmute you, Garland, so you can ask your question. Okay, looks like we have done that. So Garland, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm sorry, Dr. Jacobson, thank you so much. You said the lower Mississippi River, though, is a hybrid swarm. So what does that mean in particular?
So genetics is not my strong point, but there are studies that have come out of Southern Illinois University that have documented that a lot of the fish that look like Pallid sturgeon in the lower Mississippi River are introgressed or hybridized with shovel-nosed sturgeon. There is some debate about whether that's a relatively recent phenomenon that may have resulted from some of the alterations of both river systems, or whether in fact it's a long-term hybridization effect that could relate back to the Pleistocene and drainage changes throughout the Pleistocene.
Thank you so much, and thanks for all your work over the years. Appreciate it.
Sure.
There's a question with linkages to the recently canceled diversion projects in the lower river, where amongst several species, including dolphins, they looked at Pallid sturgeon. And the question is, the projects got canceled due to escalating costs, but curious on the face of it, would you consider extreme impacts to species, whether that be the sturgeon or the dolphins, likely to be caused by habitat restoration?
Oh, yeah, that's a tough question, because I think it's very, very specific to the species and to the restoration project. One can envision restoration that might be good for one set of species, but may not be all that good for others. the trade-off we find on the Missouri River, for example, is we can do some things for Pallid Sturgeon that might also inadvertently provide really good Asian carp or invasive carp habitat. So it's really dependent on that type of restoration and the type of species that are involved.
Thank you. Next question, what potential do you see to link floodplain management with pallid sturgeon recovery?
So possibly, it is possible that somewhere in the life cycle of the pallid sturgeon, there is a connection to the floodplain, but it is not direct. Pallid sturgeon are hydrodynamic, extremely hydrodynamic. They love high velocities. They tend to stay in the main stem of the Missouri River and the Mississippi River, and they're benthic fish. They're at the bottom. They do not, as a rule, move into the floodplain. Some of the baby larval sturgeon have been captured in floodplains when the river has, like during the 2019 flood, 2011 flood. They can get evicted into the floodplain, but they are just not a floodplain adapted species. They don't, they aren't found there in a way that you can connect them as a piece of their habitat. In the broader sense of things, that floodplain connectivity and exchange of nutrients and perhaps the effect on the prey base for the pallid sturgeon, those things could be there, but it's an indirect sort of connection that's not as easy to establish as it would be if you actually found the pallid sturgeon, especially the adults, routinely into the floodplain, which we don't.
You mentioned the cost of levee setbacks. Do you have thoughts on how ecosystem restoration and ecosystem goods and services can help address the low benefit cost ratios for rural flood resiliency projects under comprehensive benefits?
Yes, I have a lot of thoughts about that. Probably more than I can, go into. But what I see happening on the Missouri River now, there's some work on some pilot projects along the Missouri River, and the Corps is struggling to come up with benefit cost ratios greater than 1 for these areas to protect agricultural lands. So and the whole idea of how comprehensive benefits, all 4 of the accounts are put together to come up to change which alternative could be selected, seems to be a bit of a Wild West situation. I don't see a lot of clear understanding of how this is working. I think it'd be very useful if those ecosystem services could be monetized and they would be part of the National Economic Development account. I think it would really help clarify things. Another part of this is I worked with a group at the Missouri Watershed at the University of Missouri. They are trying to do a better job of evaluating benefits to agricultural areas. They think they are undervalued and that better economics would help them increase the benefits of some of these levee setbacks, both for what they're protecting on the dry side, as well as what they are providing in terms of ecosystem benefits on the wet side. Over.
One last question. The person who asked that question also says, seems like there's many opportunities to reconnect communities to the river too in this type of restoration. So the question, in this 4th stage of restoration, is there a particular agency or organization that coordinates the activities in that 4th stage? Are there entities trying to understand the ecological effect?
As far as trying to understand the ecological effects, it seems like most of that is being done through academia. There's some interest from the Corps, especially the engineering and nature folks, to do a better job getting at those ecosystem services. Right now, the money that is available to do levee setbacks, to create more resilient systems, is coming from the Corps of Engineers. There has been, after the 2019 flood, the lower 4 states of Nebraska, Iowa, Kansas, and Missouri did get together, and they've helped push for some comprehensive studies and attempting to get to resilience in lower states. But most of the money still is coming from the Corps in pushing this thing forward. And then it's mainly academia that's looking at those ecosystem benefits. But there's, I think, my point of view, a disconnect between the work that's done on those ecosystem services and the routine way the Corps goes about doing their analyses, because it's those broader views of ecosystem services have not yet been incorporated in the core standard methodology.
Great. Well, thank you so much for your presentation, and thanks to everyone for joining. Thanks for the great questions. We will package this up and have this available on our website if you'd like to share it with anybody in just a couple of days. And we will be back in your feed with another wonderful webinar next month. So again, thank you so much, Dr. Jacobson. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you. It's been my pleasure.